welcome to Candid Conversation Zoomed In and Comments video channel. My name is Cliff, and this morning I'm speaking with Dr. Chris Labos. He's a cardiologist, epidemiologist, that's a pretty hard word to say, and also a lecturer at McGill. And thank you very much, Dr. Labos, for taking the time to come in and speak with us today. I saw a very interesting article that you did for the Gazette talking about swimming and the fact that at one point, people have always heard this from moms especially, don't go in the water if you've had lunch. And you basically did an article about this and talked about how that might not be necessarily true. We might not really have to wait an hour for that. Can you explain what that article was about?
So that article in the Montreal Gazette was really about debunking this idea that you have to wait before you go swimming. The physiology is a little bit complicated, but a little bit interesting. The whole idea behind this fear is that if you were to eat a large meal and then go swimming, you'd be directing all or most of your blood flow to your gastrointestinal system, and you wouldn't have enough blood left over to go to your muscles so you could swim. You would cramp up, you wouldn't be able to swim, and then you would drown. That's sort of the basic idea of what this fear is all about. But the whole point of the article was really sort of to explain a few things. First of all, go to the beach, go to any beach anywhere. The vast majority of the people at the beach are not actually swimming, right? They're suntanning, which is also not good for you. They're by the water, they're playing volleyball, they're playing games on the sand. If they are in the water, they're sort of in the shallow area right by the beach. So the idea, even if this physiologically was true, the vast majority of people are not going to be at risk for drowning because they are not going into deep water. Now, if you were going to go into deep water and you were dependent on your ability to swim in order to not drown, there's other things you have to keep in mind. People who do swim for exercise or professionally or competitively, I mean, they do sometimes get cramps. What do you do when that happens? Well, you float, right? A human being can float in water for a very extensive period of time. So even if you did get a cramp or some other injury, the mechanism you would have would be to float. And of course, if you're in an isolated area, that's another thing. But if you're in an area with people, you could call people over for help. You could get yourself out of that situation relatively easily. But even if you were sort of excluding those possibilities and you were saying, well, physiologically, is there a danger to eating food before you go swimming? I think when you actually look at how your body processes food and what sort of some of the science says, yes, there might be some degree of impairment if you eat a large meal just before you go out and do a competitive swim, but that issue is going to be fairly minor for most people. And when you look at the published scientific evidence, the response people have to a large meal is fairly variable. And of course, even that time interval, which, differs depending on who you ask. Some people say 30 minutes, some people say 60 minutes, some people say 90 minutes. The reality is that food is going to be in your stomach for a fairly long period of time when you eat a large meal. So even that isn't really based on any type of sort of solid scientific evidence.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, it's called burgeromery or something like that, and it takes about 24 hours for digestion to take place.
Well,
So
it takes about 24 hours for food to pass through your entire gastrointestinal tract, but that includes your stomach, your small intestine, and your large intestine. If you're talking about just your stomach, food will stay in there for a few hours, 2, 3, 4 hours. I mean, it obviously varies. But yeah, so that's really the issue. Now, most of the digestion is done by the time you get into the large intestine, but yeah, it's going to take a while for food to progress through your gastrointestinal system. And so the idea that 30 minutes is going to make a difference, I mean, probably not. I think where most of this comes from, I think most people have the intuitive self-awareness to know if you eat a large meal, you don't get up and then try to run a 5K immediately afterwards. You're going to feel bloated, you're going to feel tired. So that's obviously a thing. I mean, don't eat just before you exercise. That's just plain common sense. But it's not because you're sort of impairing blood flow to any significant degree to your muscles. You're just feeling bloated. And of course, most people after they eat a large meal, that upregulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which sort of, if as opposed to the parasympathetic system is instead of the fight or flight, of the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. So it's, the thing that sort of calms you down. So we have to differentiate what I think most people do intuitively, which is don't exercise after a large meal because it's going to feel unpleasant because you're going to be so bloated, and differentiate that from what has become this sort of prevailing myth that, it's going to be dangerous to swim right after you eat. I mean, probably not based on how most people utilize the water, which is really just to play in the water rather than to go out and swim competitively or intensely in deep waters.
How do you think we got to this particular myth? Where do you think this comes from, or did you take a look at that?
I mean, it's always hard to track where these things come from. I mean, nobody really knows. I think it's just something that just keeps getting repeated over and over again. It probably does stem from the fact that most people know that you're going to feel bloated right
Mm,
after you eat. So don't do any physical exertion immediately after a meal. Let yourself digest and then do your exercise afterwards or even before. And we can get into this whole complex conversation. Is there a best time to exercise? The short answer
mm.
is no. The best time to exercise is right now, because if you don't do it now, you probably won't do it later. But
Yeah.
this is one of those things that just keeps perpetuating over and over again. And I think the key that it's not based on any single source is that the number people use, like how long should you wait after a meal before you go swimming, is different. Some people say 30 minutes, some people say 60 minutes, some people say 90 minutes, some people say 2 hours. And you sort of realize that it's not really based on any single source. It's just some of this folksy wisdom that people have, which really actually isn't based on sound science.
So, what does the science say about this kind of thing? I know that there was some study done with people regarding this with respect to cramping. Was there or is there any kind of science that backs the idea up that this is not something to worry about?
Uh, there have so a lot of these are surveys, right? Basically, what you're doing is you're asking people after exercise, after swimming, do you experience cramping? I think the data here is a little bit inconsistent. I mean, for anybody who's interested to go into a deep dive, I wrote an article about this for the Montreal Gazette. It's really available online. So just Google my name, Christopher Labos, Montreal Gazette, swimming after a meal, it'll come up, and I hyperlink to all the relevant studies. So for people who really want to get into the weeds, you can go into it. I think when you look at the research such as it is, I mean, it shouldn't be shocking to people that this isn't something in which a lot of research has been done because it's not really going to impact anyone's life. It's interesting from the exercise physiology standpoint, but it's not really a medical disease that needs to be treated. So there's not a lot of research on this. There is some. It's not entirely consistent overall. Yeah, you might have some cramping after exercise in some people, but it really depends. And it largely probably depends on what you eat more than anything else. I mean, some meals are going to be harder to quote unquote digest and might give you more
Mhm.
symptoms if you try to exercise afterwards.
So one of the things too, also mentioned in this article, is that the real killer for people is drinking and
Yeah.
swimming. That's a really bad idea. And is that because of certain things like the fact that you're more relaxed after having a couple of drinks?
No, I think the main issue here, the alcohol is involved in a lot of drowning and boating accidents because it is alcohol. I mean, with boating, I mean, we often don't think of boats in the same way that we think of cars, but it is a motor vehicle, right? So
Hmm.
accidents happen, and alcohol impairs your reflexes and your judgment and your ability to operate a motor vehicle. And so this does happen. With alcohol too, what happens is people drink and they put themselves in dangerous situations and sometimes get into situations where, they can't get themselves out of it. They'll go in too deep. They'll go swimming in a dangerous area. People who go swimming after they drink are maybe doing it in a more isolated environment where they don't have like a lifeguard that will come help them. So there's probably a lot of factors that play into it, but alcohol is a major factor in drownings, and so I think that's important. Again, you understand where this comes from. Like people are on vacation, they might be at a resort, there's an open bar, they drink a lot. You have to be a little bit careful. And again, I won't tell people how to live their lives, but alcohol is not good for you. The prevailing myth that red wine is good for your heart, absolutely not true. Written about that extensively as well. If you want to go on vacation, have some drinks and sit on the beach, you can do whatever you want. but bear in mind that alcohol is going to impair your ability to, it's going to increase the risk that you're involved in a fatal drowning incident. So just be a little bit careful about drinking before you go into the water. If all you're going to do is sit on a deck chair, then that's fine, as long as you wear sunscreen and try to stay out of the sun, because the sun is also not your friend. That's my other sort of piece of advice for people who are planning
Yeah, I think,
vacations.
yeah, absolutely. You want to have a safe vacation and enjoy the pool and all that good stuff. What got you interested in this? I'm curious to know why you kind of took this dive into this. What was the prevailing thought?
Well, yeah. So the main motivation is that I write a biweekly article for the Montreal Gazette, so I had to file something. So I had to come up with some idea, and I can't remember what the actual source of it was. I think I was speaking with somebody about this, and they had said, "Hey, is this true?" And I said, "Well, no, for X, Y, Z reasons, all the stuff that we've already talked about."
Hmm.
And I said, well, let me make this. So, it is on the Montreal Gazette website for people who want to go and read it. I think a lot of these articles also get syndicated across the Post Media network, so you can even find it on your local newspaper site if they're part of the Post Media family. But yeah, you just Google them online. I mean, I have a lot of different articles out there. So my primary focus in life is not talking about swimming and eating, but I try to use the column to sort of debunk medical myths, to sort of explain to people why some things are not true and why some things are true. So I sort of use it as a, excuse me, I sort of use it as a general medical column where I can sort of explore different things, sometimes even outside of where my primary practice is in cardiology, just about general health stuff or whatever is trending and what is sort of interesting to people.
Yeah, that sounds like that's a lot of fun to do because I'm sure even yourself, do you ever find something and you go, "Oh, I even didn't know that," when you're doing this kind of research?
Yeah, you always do because you always learn quite a bit when you read up on it because I'm not just writing opinion pieces, right? I'm trying to back it up. I'm trying to do a review of the scientific evidence. So you always read up on stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be reading up on. So I just wrote an article about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which I thought was interesting. And I know a little bit about it because it is a valid medical treatment. But somebody pointed out to me that it's become this huge thing, at least here in Montreal and probably across Canada, of these like private wellness clinics offering hyperbaric oxygen therapy to healthy people that frankly don't need it. And
Mhm.
so I said, well, I better write an article explaining what hyperbaric oxygen therapy is, what are the indications, what are the contraindications, what does it do, what does it not do? Because you do see all kinds of crazy claims about it, being a cure for autism and epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. I mean, none of that is true, right? So
Wow.
you do sort of learn about these things. I'm going to write an article next week. I'll give you a sneak preview. It's going to be about probiotics because there's a study that just came out showing that probiotics, they really don't do all that much. And so I'm aware of the body of evidence on these issues because you just are, but it's always good to have a refresher. And I think most people just don't make the effort to do these types of refreshers. Whereas because I have this column and because I have to write something, it forces me to look back at these issues and say, okay, what is the evidence actually saying?
Yeah, and I take it as a cardiologist, you're seeing a lot of this stuff that comes to the fore, and not only does it affect one part of the body, it can also affect, well, the heart. Is a lot of the stuff that you deal with basically things that could really affect the heart as well?
I mean, I tend to cast a pretty broad net, all things considered. Like the probiotics thing is really a gastrointestinal issue rather than a cardiac issue. It doesn't really have many cardiac implications, but a lot of things do. And I think if you're in clinical practice these days, you have to be a little bit broad because I mean, there's just the reality just here in Canada now is so many people don't have access to a family doctor. It's hard to get an appointment for stuff. So if there's stuff that you can easily fix yourself, I think it sort of behooves you to at least try to do it if you have the competence to do so. Now, I'm not saying you should try to do everything. You got to know your limits and stay within them. But I think you need to be a little bit broad based for stuff because people are complicated and no one, gone are the days when people would come into the doctor's office with one specific problem. They have sort of multiple issues, uh,
Mm.
usually interplaying with each other, and you have to at least have the context for knowing how to sort of respond to that.
Yeah, medicine is definitely very complex. And I want to say thank you very much for taking the few moments with us here to talk about this stuff. I think it's fascinating. I read the article and I was like, I didn't know that. That's a really
Mhm.
interesting thing. And I was like totally blown away by that. And I think the takeaway here is that don't believe everything you hear out there. Check it out, fact check it
Yeah,
with, things like your article. And if people want to get in touch with you and find out
yeah.
more about what you do and
Yeah.
your articles and that, how would they do so?
So best way is to take a brick and throw it through my window, tie a message around it. That's the most direct way to get in touch with me. There's a few ways that you can sort of reach out. I mean, the usual social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, or X now. I mean, LinkedIn. I don't really spend that much time on Instagram, but multiple social media platforms. Just look for Christopher Labos. There's only one of me. I do a podcast with my friend Jonathan called The Body of Evidence, which, as the name implies, is about examining the body of evidence on various medical issues. So you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. So again, Christopher Labo's Body of Evidence. There's really only one. If you find the Madonna movie, you've gone to the wrong place. And if you're really interested, I am going to. I wrote a book called Does Coffee Cause Cancer? It's about dispelling food myths. And if you want to find out if coffee causes cancer, well, you have to read the book. It
Read the
doesn't,
book.
but it doesn't. But it is the only science book that's written as a romantic comedy. So you can read it as a romantic comedy, but the characters in the book are talking about food and food myths and epidemiology. And so you'll learn a little bit about science, but you'll be sort of entertained along the way as well.
That's fantastic. Again, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us, Dr. Christopher Labos. Appreciate it a lot. I will make sure this gets onto our channel. You've been watching the latest upload here on Candid Conversation Zoomed In and Comments video channel. My name is Cliff. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks again.